There's a story in the Old Testament that, to be honest, I consider the most disturbing of the entire Bible. It could easily be considered inappropriate for minors. Therefore, before continuing, I want to make sure you know that this video is not suitable for all ages and may trigger some kind of trauma from your past. The story I'm referring to is found in chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges. Many people know chapter 19 but don't read the rest of the story. I believe there are several important lessons we need to learn from such a disturbing story. First, I will tell the story in the most dramatic way possible, and then I will explore the lessons that I believe we can learn from it. In chapter 19 of Judges verse 1, in those days when there was no king in Israel, a Levite who lived in a remote part of the hill country of Ephraim took to him a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Imagine a Levite man living in the northern part of Israel who takes this woman to be his concubine, a sort of second-class wife. She lived in the south in Bethlehem. She was unfaithful to him and left him, returning to her father's house in Bethlehem of Judah, where she stayed for 4 months. Imagine the pain and humiliation this man must have felt being betrayed and abandoned. Determined to recover his concubine, the Levite travels from the northern mountainous region of Ephraim to the south to Bethlehem. It's a long and arduous journey, full of dangers and uncertainties. Every step he took was a mix of hope and bitterness. When he arrives, her father is very hospitable. However, many times the man says, "I must leave, give me my wife so we can go back home." And the father responds, "No, stay one more night." He says, "Okay, I will stay one more night." And this repeats for several days until finally the Levite insists, "With all due respect, I appreciate your hospitality, but I need to go, I need to return home." Reluctantly, the father allows them to depart. The tragedy begins when the Levite, his concubine, and his servant are traveling from Bethlehem in the south of Israel to the north to Ephraim. Near Jebus, the day was ending. The servant said to his master, "Please, why don't we stop in this city of Jebus and spend the night here?" But his master replied, "We will not stop in a foreign city where there are no Israelites. Let's continue to Gibeah." So they continued their journey, and the sun set as they approached Gibeah in Benjamin. To their surprise, no one was willing to take them in, something unusual in Israelite culture, where hospitality was a fundamental value. Fatigue and frustration grew with each refusal. By the end of the night, an elderly man appeared in the square and said, "Why are you still here? Has no one taken you into their house?" They replied, "No, no one has taken us in." And the elderly man, with a look of concern, said, "You can stay with me tonight." The Levite thanked him. "Great. I just want to warn you that we don't need anything from you. We have enough food for our donkeys, for me, and for my concubine. We just need a place to rest our heads. If you give me a pillow, that's all I need." The elderly man replied, "No problem. You can stay with me." While they were in the elderly man's house, enjoying a simple meal, trying to find some relief amidst the tension of the journey, suddenly, wicked men from the city surrounded the house and beat on the door. They said to the householder, "Bring out the man who came to your house so that we may know him sexually." The situation took a terrible turn. These perverted men of Gibeah demanded that the Levite be handed over to them to be abused. "Let me bring out my virgin daughter and his concubine. Abuse them and do whatever you want with them, but do not commit this outrage against this man." In a desperate and tragic act, the Levite handed over his concubine to the men of the city. They raped and abused her the entire night until dawn. At dawn, they let her go. Imagine the horror and agony this young woman endured. The night seemed endless, a nightmare of pain and humiliation. She was raped throughout the night by a group of men, and by morning she was left to die. At dawn, she managed, with her last strength, to crawl back to the house where her master was. Each step she took was a battle against unbearable pain, against exhaustion that threatened to consume her body and soul. When she reached the door, she collapsed, exhausted and wounded, her hands clinging to the threshold of the door as a last desperate effort to survive. When the Levite got up in the morning, he opened the doors of the house and went out to continue his journey. There was his concubine, collapsed near the door of the house, her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said, "let's go." But there was no answer. The woman had been so abused that she died. In a desperate and outraged act, the Levite placed her body on his donkey and left for his home. What happens next is even more horrifying. When he entered his house, he took a knife, grabbed his concubine, and cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb. Then he sent each piece throughout the territory of Israel as a cry for justice and a call for vengeance. All who saw it said, "Nothing like this has ever happened or been seen from the day the Israelites came up from Egypt to this day." The impact of this act was devastating. Each piece sent was a silent testimony of the brutality and injustice suffered. The sight of the concubine's remains scattered throughout Israel caused a cry of horror and indignation. The tribes of Israel gathered, shocked and enraged by the atrocity committed. The Levite, still in shock and pain, told his story to them, his voice trembling with rage and sadness. "My concubine and I sought shelter in Gibeah, and there she was brutally raped and murdered. I sent her in pieces so everyone could see the evil that occurred." The hearts of the tribes were filled with fury and sorrow. They decided that such an act could not go unpunished. They united against the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that they hand over the men responsible. But the Benjamites, proud and stubborn, refused. Thus began a terrible and bloody civil war. The battle was long and brutal. Brothers fighting against brothers, the bloodshed soaking the Holy Land. Many lives were lost, and suffering spread throughout the land. The tribe of Benjamin was almost wiped out, and Israel as a whole was deeply scarred by the violence and pain. The tragedy of Gibeah left a permanent scar on the soul of a nation. And so the story of the Levite and his concubine became a dark symbol of what happens when justice is abandoned and humanity succumbs to depravity and cruelty. It is a powerful reminder of the depths of evil that humans are capable of, but also of the need for compassion, justice, and mercy in a world that is often cruel and unforgiving. May this disturbing story make us reflect on our own actions and choices, and inspire us to always seek justice and goodness, even in the most difficult circumstances. May we never forget the painful lessons of the past so that we can build a more just and compassionate future for all. This man took his concubine home, cut her into 12 pieces, and no doubt attached a letter to each piece of his deceased concubine, and sent a different piece of her body to the 12 tribes of Israel, with a letter telling exactly what had been done by their own brothers, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. And when these other tribes saw and read what had happened to this woman, they said, "Nothing like this has ever happened in our history." The scene that unfolded before the eyes of the tribes was one of indescribable horror. Each piece of flesh, wrapped in a cloak of despair, carried a message engraved not only in ink, but in blood. The man who sent these pieces, consumed by pain and the desire for justice, went beyond human comprehension. With every blow dealt, with every piece cut, he felt his soul shatter along with the body of the woman he had once loved. The metallic smell of blood filled the air while bitter tears streamed down his face, falling like tiny drops from an ocean of suffering. When the leaders of the tribes of Israel received the macabre packages, they were stunned. The words written in the accompanying letters were raw and brutal, exposing the barbarity committed by the tribe of Benjamin. The images of the dismembered body parts remained etched in their minds, indelible marks of a nightmare that could not be erased. The horror was so overwhelming that even some of the bravest men vomited, unable to endure the harrowing sight. The full story, detailed in chapters 20 and 21 of Judges, unveils additional layers of tragedy and misery. These events reflect the moral and spiritual degradation of a nation that had completely turned away from God. Chaos reigned supreme, for in those days there was no king in Israel. The lack of leadership, the absence of justice, and the disregard for personal responsibility transformed the people into beings capable of the most unimaginable atrocities. The first lesson from this horror is about responsibility. Without a moral or spiritual authority to be accountable to, humans lose themselves in their passions and desires, becoming capable of the most abominable acts. The absence of a king in Israel symbolized the lack of guidance, a shepherd for the flock. People acted according to their whims, blind to the consequences of their actions, believing in the false security that their deeds would bear no repercussions. The second lesson is about the intrinsic value of every human being. The man who offered his daughter and the concubine to the aggressors did not view their lives and dignity as sacred. To him, the life of the foreigner held more value than those of his own women, revealing a cruel distortion of divine values. Every human being bears the image of God and should be treated as such, with respect and dignity. Devaluing human life leads to irreparable tragedies in a corrupt society. The third lesson highlights the danger of turning away from God. Israel, gradually abandoning divine precepts, plunged into an abyss of sin and despair. The nation, once prosperous and blessed, became a battleground where brothers killed brothers, and the law of the jungle prevailed. The departure from God is not immediate. It is a slow process where small deviations accumulate until they result in total and devastating separation. The story reaches a tragic climax in Judges chapter 20 with a devastating civil war. The tribes of Israel, inflamed by indignation and a desire for justice, rose against Benjamin. The battle was fierce, bloody, and relentless. Thousands of lives were lost, turning the sacred ground into a cemetery of mutilated bodies and shattered dreams. In the end, only 600 men of the tribe of Benjamin remained, marked by fear and desolation. In Judges chapter 21, the narrative reaches a new level of despair. The 11 tribes, now aware of the consequences of their actions, faced a moral dilemma. The tribe of Benjamin was on the brink of extinction, with only 600 men and no wives. In desperation, the tribes decided to invade Jabesh-Gilead, killing all the men and capturing 400 women to give them as wives to the Benjaminites. However, 200 men were still without wives. The solution was equally shocking. During a festival, the Benjaminites were to abduct women, so they would technically not break their vow of not giving their daughters as wives. This chain of poor decisions demonstrates how one wrong action can unleash a series of uncontrollable consequences. The sin of the Benjaminites led to war, death, abduction, and an endless cycle of violence and pain. The story in Judges ends on a bitter note. Though not without a glimpse of God's grace, the tribe of Benjamin, despite everything, was able to rebuild and continue. However, the scars of poor choices remained, reminding everyone that every decision carries eternal weight. As we reflect on this story, we are called to recognize the importance of responsibility, the value of human life, closeness to God, and the consequences of our actions. May we learn from the mistakes of the past and strive for lives of justice, love, and compassion, knowing that every decision we make shapes our future and that of those around us.